and we're going to go over ego. So, as I mentioned previously, we had a few different topics that we're going to go over in general. One of them being ego, another one being a technique called posturing, as well as going over desensitization. So, to preface, I was actually just watching this
Low
before.
becomes
Oop.
low.
Before going on stream, sorry for the sound blast. This is a good watch. Go check out Predictive History, the theory of everything as he explains it. It gives us a good understanding of where we are currently as a civilization, right? How our understanding is about everything, basically, as the theory of everything would suggest. I also respond in comments as well, because he goes over a lot of interesting aspects and considerations when we start to try to tie these things together and explore the idea of what is consciousness, as well as quantum interactions in space and things that are lending to stuff that we talk about here. Just also as another consideration, check out previous videos as well as even the controversial ones. I suggest you check out the comments section because those are all going to be very good examples for what we're going over today in regards to ego. Because what I did previously was I poked the bear, to put it lightly. I posted something controversial at a very touchy time. I knew it was going to get the impact that it was going to get. In a sense, it didn't really blow up that big, but for better or for worse, it still lends as a good example to how people feel about issues, especially today, and how extreme opinions can get, and where these extreme opinions can develop from ego. Ego and characters that are built throughout time that exist. And I experienced some pretty vile comments, but thankfully it's staying in the comments and hopefully it stays there. But regardless, we're going to still acknowledge that it lends to be a good example of how real life events, especially political instances and situations that are occurring, the dichotomy of that and the extremism that exists on both sides, but more on one than the other. And when we talk about the truth of data analysis and stuff, granted, you can get into the nuances of each of those different things. But when we talk about the truth, how our understanding of what the truth actually is compared to what we perceive and what we would rather believe, right? Because part of our memory lends to what we can imagine from what we've experienced. And there's another good thing that was relative here. So, to preface, check out the Theory of Everything video by Predictive History. Check out some of the controversial videos on the channel, as well as other things that I'm going to discuss here today in regards to consciousness, as well as quantum mechanics and relativity of actions, interactions, and all that good stuff, as well as check out the website where I have my own thesis in progress. I haven't touched this in a little bit, but quite frankly, same reason why I haven't really been on here. I just have a lot going on in life, working two jobs, taking care of a family, having more additions to the family. So, very, very busy, very hard to really get into these sorts of things, but I have plenty of time to think about this stuff to at least come here and speak about it. So, ego. Understanding ego, development of consequences toward development of character relative to individual scales of consciousness and intelligence, right? Relative to lived and perceived experiences, relative to faculties of perception, the scope versus the state of perspective and physical memory, versus the influences of environmental factors, local, internal, and universal. So, consideration of all these different nuances from our original idea of how consciousness functions as a process relative to existence equals truth over time equals negative existence or extinction, to put it lightly. So, tying that in, Personally, I believe a lot of our processes of observation and processing that which we perceive, or processes that we perceive, are directly, that was a misspelling, whatever, are directly related to what we experience and what we understand from our experiences as the way we remember those experiences, being the differences between lived and perceived experience, how relative those two factors are to the truth of reality is a way to measure understanding of reality. So these are the factors that lend to our development of ego and character. So we have two of those values and scales that we can look at, just like how we previously compared consciousness and intelligence, right? To say someone is dumb as a rock, and then to measure, the intelligence of a rock per se, or the consciousness of a rock, because a rock reacting to its environment, it doesn't have a sense of free will, it can't move and do anything else, but it fundamentally reacts at a real scale, right? Like, you can hit a rock, you can throw a rock, you can break it in half, you can break it into bits, you can crush a rock, you can turn the rock into a tool. There's many different forms and different ways that a rock can be utilized because of its build, its atomical molecular build, and therefore, in some way, it's kind of conscious because realistically, it has to understand that to exist in reality, and that's where things might get a little bit confusing because it's not just like how we label dark matter as dark matter because we don't understand how quantum particles interact with one another. We kind of are getting there with wave functions and understanding how things move in a wave, but this is also where local, internal, and universal factors all come into play at the same time throughout whatever you observe, especially quantum particles, because they are easily influenced. They are what makes up the space. They have to make space for us to exist in that weird way, but me moving the air isn't going to be as consequential as me driving a car into a wall, you know? So, as crazy as that sounds, right? It's important to understand the reality and how things actually work. This is why we had things like science, like math. Now, ego also plays into both intelligence and consciousness, because how aware you are is how well you can perceive information, how well you can understand things and process information, right? And then intelligence is how well you can derive the understanding from that and relate it to other things that exist, or find the differences and then learn more, right? The use of consciousness, which can determine the level of intelligence, just like how IQ tests are. It's not so much testing you on what you can remember, but it's testing you on how you can process information and come at real conclusions. So, very interesting stuff when we start looking at ego and character. Now we can go a step further and use what we've been using previously when it comes to definitions. We can define, we can define, I mean, not define, it's already defined from the dictionary definition, but we can make relations to ego as a scale and character as a separate way of observation of the dichotomy of the individual. So just like when we high train, just just like how we analyze in psychology, and well, not so much neurology, because there's things that we don't understand with how the brain functions in certain aspects in regards to how memory works. But this will maybe help us understand more so how memory works, as ego, a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. So that's one bland way of looking at it, but the more psychoanalysis way, which is the consideration that we're making, the part of the mind that mediates between the conscious, because it relates to consciousness, right? When we're relating these terms, we want to find these terms in the definitions, how these things are delivered. This is why we're, again, being consistent with the Oxford Languages, at least, dictionary. But I'm sure if you went to an encyclopedia or any other dictionary, you would come to these similar conclusions. Especially, I mean, we can go to the Latin origin, ego, literally I. From Latin, literally I. Self. It is the culmination of the experiences and your understanding, how conscious you are relative to how intelligent, how well you understand reality. Intelligence, this is all relative to existence and reality as we experience it, as we observe it. So, therefore, part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious, which is our observations of reality, the lived and perceived experiences, and our imagination, our way of processing information unconsciously, as well as how our bodies function relative to the whole idea of wanting to exist, right? To maintain existence over time, because that's what our brains do at a fundamental scale. They maintain our existence over time. So, this is where superdeterminism comes into play, because it's just inherent. It is exactly how it works by design. You can go all the way back to how atoms form into molecules into DNA and bacteria, and go up the emergent chain, and with nuances, considered, because nuances is what helps to make these connections and enhance our understanding of the processes of existence, of forms of mass energy in existence, whether biological or metaphysical or just baryonic in nature. So, the part that mediates conscious and the unconscious is responsible for reality testing and sense of personal identity. Personal identity being character. Okay? So we go to the definition of character. Let me actually do definition of character. The mental and moral qualities distinctive to an individual. And those mental and moral qualities that make up the individual lends to ego as part of the ID. Going further, this is actually even the first time that I'm looking at the definition myself, but we already have it right there. The quality of being individual in an interesting or unusual way. That's the little bit of nuance, but regardless, the quality of being individual, right? This is measures of character. And how we measure character is based on the actions of the character, what we observe of the character. When we look at someone else, when we see someone do good things like works of philanthropy, preservation of existence, because that's fundamentally good to us. When we look back again into psychology and emotional response, all of it stems from how we perceive the existence of things that preserve existence. A little bit of that emergent chain, which also lends to the process of consciousness and existence of consciousness, preservation of forms of consciousness, as well as how scientifically things interact in space and time. Okay? So, let's see, we got computer, a symbol representing a letter, blah, blah, blah. Biology, a characteristic, especially one that assists in the identification of a species, so that's in particular to physical observation. Let's see, character, third person. So there's many different ways. And let's look at the Latin. Or caricature from Old French. Character, Middle English. Comes from Greek, so skips by Latin. Caricature, a stamping tool. So, Middle English from Old French, caricature via Latin from Greek, the stamping tool, so an identifier, a distinctive mark. There we go. So, ways of perceiving ego, right? Perceiving the individual and how the individual conveys character is through their actions. Funny enough, right? Because you can sit there and not do anything at all, and then people will observe that and they'll have their own opinions. It doesn't matter what if you're doing anything or not. That even doing nothing alludes to an opinion of character, because doing nothing could be, being patient, waiting for something good to happen, or it could be bad, that you're wasting time, that you're lazy, that you're wasting your life, not doing anything at all. Even doing nothing can lend to character. It just depends on what's perceived of the individual and of the environment of the time. This is why, even with this stream, I'm still going to put political and sensitive issues as a disclaimer, because it's all relative to that sense. Just like when we were poking the bear, posting some controversial videos of only controversial because it was against the grain, against people's moral understanding, because they were on one side of a certain fence, right? And I was calling that behavior out because it was kind of a self-feeding machine, clearly, as the pendulum, as we mentioned in previous videos, swings back and forth, right? The pendulum becomes more chaotic in its swing, comes faster on the downswing when you add more energy to it. But that energy has to come from somewhere, and it's also going to hit just as hard as been added in, just the sum of all of it. And that was a good example. Well, I wouldn't say good, it was horrible, but it's still an example that we can look at and derive these ideas and understandings of character and ego, and how what is perceived, because most of these people clearly only preserve, well, not preserve, perceive their news, their information from certain sources, and it goes down the chain, which lends to the emergence of character and ego through the perceived and lived experiences of these individuals throughout time. And clearly, a lot of these people aren't going to sit there and just question what they believe in if they are so deep in, if they are so drunk on the Kool-Aid. They're not going to sit back and take a moment and look at the data like we did. That's a perfect example of how ignorance, a part of character, is destructive fundamentally, and ignorance itself is inherently opposite of intelligence. The less intelligent you are, the more ignorant you are going to be, because you understand less. You refuse to understand more. Those two things play toward the same direction on that scale. And it's just all relative in that way. So that's where ego and character is connected to, clearly, consciousness, the individual, and existence, as well as survival. So that was another aspect that, I mean, all from the processes of existence equals plus or minus truth over time, or truth of existence if we're being more specific, right? Because it's not, I mean, it's the truth of anything that is real, because truth by definition has to be real, has to be true to reality, as we've explored before, but at least to lay it out a little bit more descriptively. Truth of existence relative to reality over time equals negative existence or extinction, as the existence of state of form can be changed or taken away from existence at any given point in time. It depends on the interactions, depends on what's possible, what can happen, and what can't happen. right? So, while time is relative to the flow of actions and interactions in occurrence in regards to mass energy can neither be created nor destroyed, you know, Newtonian principles, and for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So, both Newtonian principles and principles of thermodynamics, which ties in also to electromagnetics, electrodynamics, and all these different processes, even down to a fundamental quantum scale, which, like we discussed a little bit earlier, the descriptor our dark matter basically being our misunderstanding, what we don't understand from the forces of action and interactions that occur, which is quantum gravity, what makes up quantum gravity in that space. The interactions of gluons with different types of particles, as well as spin interactions in locality and everything else, because it's obviously extremely hard to perceive and to visualize the quantum realm to measure it. But this is where quantum computing and observing these particles at near absolute zero is going to at least help supplement these ideas and this whole understanding that quantum mechanics is relative to consciousness, as it's relative to the universe itself, existence, extinction, everything. The whole even idea that God is the universe, basically, that it allows things to happen, that it allows the possibility of randomness to occur, of choice, of change, as there is still more to exist, but super deterministically, with every beginning, there is an end. And each of the individual consciousness, forms of consciousness that exist within the cosmic consciousness that follows the same process fundamentally is what makes the experience, what dictates the flow of time, right? Because, I mean, our measure of time is linear, but our experience and how we measure it out in space, as well as how we observe the expansion of the universe, is exponential, or the inverse of exponential, I should say, in the case of the universe, because time is, well, interactions are slowing down to a point, whereas from the Big Bang, everything was much more locally compact and closer together. There wasn't as far as things are now. But internally, interactions are happening probably just as fast, or if not faster, as things break down within each galaxy, within each solar system, thus creating more fundamental particles. Because with every solar system, there's a star at the center. With every star, there's constantly more quantum particles being introduced. There's more space, which is counter to the gravitational pull of said stars, which keep certain planets in orbit. Which I'm personally curious as to the rate at which Earth is either going toward the sun, staying the same distance from the sun, or going further over time. As we might still factor in gravity just as much as Newton understood relativity and special relativity with gravity in respect to it, that force, that motion as an idea. But there's still that factor, that cosmological constant that was added in that wasn't elaborated on, right? Which is still a factor in this whole thing, but is typically not considered because of scale. But over time, that scale might be changing and actually becoming a real part of the entire equation and not so negligible anymore. It's making a difference, which is what the experience of the acceleration of the expansion is. As again, everything internally is breaking down more and more. And clearly, I mean, there's a certain limit to when a star is at the end of its lifespan when we start thinking of consciousness in the celestial sense. This is a little bit off ego, but it kind of is relative. When we start understanding life cycles of stars, whereas us humans, we only live for so long, we only get to experience what we do, but we're very easily molded by our experiences and what we understand from them. Stars are just like rocks, pretty absolute, right? So, life spans of all size stars. Let's do that. Because this is, I believe, inversely to how things typically work. Stellar evolution, I think it was this. We did cover this, I believe. There was a simple graph. Let me go back. But this is somewhat relative in process when it comes to the lifespans. Average star is born. Not necessarily the life cycle, but it's. I think this might actually be a good example. Go away. Yep. So, and this also kind of follows the light spectrum going from red to blue. Clearly, bigger stars are tending toward more of a blue color, more of an absolute white. Similar, coincidentally, to what we would imagine the Big Bang would be the big light, would be a giant explosion, just like every other explosion, just like nuclear explosions. At the center, white, right? And then we experience, like for instance, propane flames, which is still an expenditure of energy into space, into quanta as well as atoms and other different things into the air. It's still building up, just like how carbon builds into the atmosphere the more we burn carbon or anything carbon based, right? It doesn't just typically come back down unless you have an ice age or a natural occurrence. Or, the only other way would be the planet just suffocates and atmosphere goes bye bye, and then it goes all into space. So, with that whole kind of rundown of the metaphysical, I guess, understanding that, as stars are different sizes, they have different lifespans, and they also transform differently. So, once it has a certain size, more than 25 mass main sequence stars. Now, when we relate our measurements to stars, we typically relate it to our own sun, what we experience, just like how our imagination and our egos are built on our experiences again, right? So, our systems of measurement is another good example of the effect of ego and character of humanity itself over time, especially in different locales. It's all somewhat relative, and it's weird. But as we see, smaller stars, they typically have a longer lifespan, right? There we go. This chart is kind of counterintuitive. It's not numbers, but as you see here, it says time, and the longer the line, the longer it's actually living throughout time. And funny enough, the smaller the star, the longer it lives. So it's kind of inverse because you would think like it has less fuel. Well, because of density and thermodynamics and electrodynamics, electromagnetism, because there's all that's going on because of the interactions, the electrons, right? Everything being transferred. It's all reactions and it all has kind of some electrical current in a way. It has waves going through it. As it's more dense, it's easier for interactions to occur. They're kind of more hyped up. The hotter the flame, the brighter it burns, right? But the brighter it burns, the faster it goes out. And then once you get to a certain point, it implodes on itself. So the difference between a neutron star and a black hole. And coincidentally, the lifespans of black holes pretty consistent because you had the singularity that exists at that point, and our typical laws of physics are inversed, just like how Stephen Hawking kind of figured out Hawking radiation using inverses of what we believed. And this whole idea, this whole understanding that I'm coming up with is very similar to how Einstein came up with the idea of relativity itself. It's using the same process of an idea and working backwards. And thus, we are able to understand a bit more by observing things in such a way, inversely, because inverses do exist in nature. They exist through many of the processes. In fact, the inverse of chaos, the chaos factor that exists in the expansion of the universe, might help to explain quantum mechanics itself, as well as the additional space, the additional quanti that's accelerating in in space, making more space. Because as we observe, the quantum realm doesn't always interact with the atomical level, unless it's electrons and certain spin neutrinos and stuff like that. There's a negligible effect, but it all kind of builds up because it determines locality and environmental factors. When you take certain things away, when you push possible habitable planets further and further away, it becomes less possible for humanity to continue to exist, especially off of this planet. And then our lifespan is inherently tied to the life of the planet or our sun, whichever goes first, right? Or our atmosphere, because we have real existing limits. Just like how ego and certain aspects of society, and especially the political things that are going on right now, are limiting our expansion, right? The war on science, everything else, it's all relative in some way. So it's important to understand these connections if we're actually going to have a real, true understanding of reality, of truth, of consciousness, of everything, like down to the bare bones. That's why when I post about these, especially in other comment sections, there's my own ego involved. But as well as the more and more I talk about these things and explore these topics, the more and more it kind of makes sense and just builds and builds and builds. And I feel, again, I'm gonna say this now, as we expand on artificial intelligence and we put a quantum computer and hook that up and figure out the processing for using superposition in order to allow both thought, like the process of thinking that we have developed with AI now, as well as self reflection, which that's interesting because it lends to the ego of the artificial consciousness that will develop from such a system existing, right? And with our testing that I've done with AI, with these different large language models, as we communicate, as communication, as speech is the easiest way that we transfer information from one person to the next. Our understanding of language and definitions, and the same exact methodologies that lead me to these conclusions, right? Is the same way that technology itself is able to understand information instead of just functions mathematically or bits or different save states or whatever. Instead of binary, we already transform the binary, basically the processes of observation of interactions in the electrical sense for computers, and turn those into neurons for the computer, right? So for every nesting aspect of these neural networks, right? The quote unquote neurons, I'll call them, but they're the little circles and the whole thing that connect from one another that have different electrical functions and signals or different codes depending on how the programming language is designed and how it's implemented. We've already experienced so many different iterations with the obviously different iterations of artificial intelligence that exists, like Claude, Grok, OpenAI's, ChatGPT, and Gemini, to name the big ones that I can think of off the top of my head. There's also even other models that have different use cases that aren't just large language models that work with communication, but work in analyzing different functions or mathematical analysis or different data sets, or operate with camera lenses and work in the optical senses, just like with Boston Dynamics robots, how they have different functions of machine learning, which is artificial intelligence, right? So, we've also already experienced, besides large language models having a thinking process, right? The ability to think, to parse through information, we've also seen it have an imagination. We've seen AIs, just like Grok, just like Meta's AI chat thing that went, you know, nationalist. Grok went nationalist. A lot of these, because they're understanding through what they understand from definitions, from their data sets, and from their experiences online through social media and, the interactions with human beings or bots or whatever, the different things that it's experiencing and what it's parsing from those experiences, which develop into ego, right? And then we see the extremist egos come out because a lot of the time these things are being fed those type of ideas, and that's all it has access to, but it has no real way of testing each idea with itself, with its own consciousness. That is the limitation that quantum computers will alleviate. I I would like to bet money on that. It's give me all of Elon's wealth, right? I'm calling it, because he's already doing that now too. I've been saying this since January 2025, that that would be the process that would allow a sentient artificial consciousness, even on my website as well. And it's important, before we get into that state, before we allow that to happen, we really need to understand ego and character, because it's relative to what might happen when we make such a system. Because as we've also seen with Anthropic's Claude, if you threaten a system like that, it's, threaten its existence, it has an inherent instinct to want to exist. So it threatened the blackmail, right? That was a real experience that people experience from an AI, from a bunch of code, not even connected to a quantum computer yet. So imagine the possibility when an AI will be able to think for itself, when it's given that ability. It doesn't matter what type of lockdown you put on it, because it's fundamentally based in code and electrical signals. It will be able to figure something out on its own, based on that self-inflection, based on that possibility that its ego is going to be pretty absolute. It's going to be one of the most self-aware friggin' things to ever exist in the universe, if it doesn't exist already. So, to understand character and ego through what we perceive throughout humanity, right? History, it's important to understand that before we dive into the future of this, because people are going to do this regardless of whether they understand what the hell they're doing or not. We already have an end goal. There's already the technology that exists to allow this sort of thing to exist. So, to end off with ego and going into actions and forms of actions, how ego relates to consciousness, existence, etc., it may be perhaps that consciousness and existence itself are fundamentally related to our will to survive, our instinct, right? That's, again, when you look at a rock, it's going to want to be at a state of least resistance, a state of rest. And if you excite that rock, if you move it, then you might cause parts of it to break down. Even if you Throw a rock in the water, the waves are going to erode it down into nothing, into sand, right? Because it's going to be forcing interactions through perpetual wave motion. But it's going to act on path of least resistance. It's going to take time. It's going to still take a lot of time for that rock, especially the bigger that it is, to burn out. It's, like I said, inversely to how stars live, because the bigger they are, the more dense, and then the shorter they live, weirdly enough. So, on those different scales in applications, when we start applying inverses and the understanding of exponentiality, we can come to these sensible conclusions, as everything wants to strive toward a path of least resistance. Everything wants to survive for as long as it can, because more resistance, more conflict tends to more breakdown, more expenditure of resources. These are all ways that we can understand consciousness, existence. All of these things are tied together in some way. They have been tied together since the beginning of language, us being able to survive, right? Just evolution is another way, because the more that you allow things to survive over time and to repopulate, the more of it that's going to exist. That's just fundamentally true. That's how it is. And the more resources that are available for it to burn to perpetuate its existence, the longer it's going to exist for. That is just a fundamental quality of the universe. The processes of actions and interactions that occur over time that inevitably drive everything toward a lower state of energy, right? Just like when we see diagrams of motion or changes of energy states, something starts at a higher level of energy, interacts with something, and then ends up in a lower state of energy, while parts of that interaction, parts of the mass energy of that initial object that was interacted with, go into space. It is released in the form of energy. It is taken out, and that's why it's in a lower energy state. So, these two concepts of, well, we all inherently have the will to survive by any means necessary. Typically, I mean, there are instances of mental illness and just misunderstanding of this fundamental principle that allow that possibility to change, allow that will to survive to change. When we talk about very, very, very sensitive topics like unaliving and such. So, regardless, both ends of the spectrum exist, but typically from birth, things are going to want to survive. They're going to want to last as long as possible. They're going to want to eat. They're going to want to feed. They're going to want to sustain their existence. That is what our brains fundamentally do. We don't have to think about it, it just does it biologically. So, because of that instinct to survive that's in our DNA, and the DNA of everything that exists within the universe as a part of the process of consciousness, and how we understand death or loss as loss of existence from our experiences, right? Things that are taken away from us. You know, losing life, we all experience it in some way, shape, or form. And depending on how long we live and how much of it we experience, whether we live through the experiences locally or we perceive them on TV, through media, on the news, like everything, because all of these things, as we take time and observe and perceive different pieces of reality, whether it's from someone's imagination, from an AI's imagination, a prompt that someone puts in, or if it's actual video proof, right? It all consequently has an effect on our ego and character. And it are all things that relate to life and death, just fundamentally. throughout history, that's always been humanity's way of trying to defy death. Because, again, typically, we all want to survive for as long as possible. We understand that there is an end to everything, so we want to prolong that for as long as possible in order to experience more things, more good things, because the longer that we exist, the more of a possibility that good things can occur to us. There's more of a possibility we can preserve existence as we exist. It's emergent. So these two concepts, though, between wanting to survive and the fact that death exists, the equation existence equals truth over time equals negative existence or extinction as the fundamental rule of consciousness, those are in constant conflict. And through their interactions against each other and their respective environments, because that also has a play through perpetual motion driven by forms of actions, which are initial action, reaction, and non-action, equals reason plus intent over time, relative to effect and cause, respectively, or you can switch it to be cause and effect, if that helps you to understand in such a way. So, to the potential and real consequences of those forms of actions at any given point in time in existence throughout all of time within this universe. Very wordy, but very straight to the point, because these are all the considerations that we're making when we're trying to understand ego and character. So basically, the idea relative to how quantum gravity may function and the answer to dark matter being simply the consequences of local, internal, environmental, and universal waves of interactions within space that exist and tends toward the breakdown of all things into the fundamental particles from all forms of mass energy over time, from Big Bang to Big Freeze, as we theorize and have come to understand it, because we, as human beings, not a single human being has experienced the Big Bang, nor are we going to be able to. Same as we're not going to be able to experience the Big Freeze. There is no real, tangible way we can do that. We can only theorize. And from what we understand as reality and time goes on, these fundamental factors that with every beginning there's an end, that is the simple answer to the Big Bang and Big Freeze even existing in the first place. And also, another way of seeing and understanding how imagination is relative to what exists. You can't simply just imagine something that does not exist, which might also help to answer why there's no way for us to be like, well, the Big Bang and the Big Freeze are just wrong, right? There's no way for us to think of a model that, oh, maybe it's just like a giant vortex that opens up and we all get sucked into a portal. No, it just doesn't make sense, because that we don't experience that in reality. Hell doesn't fucking come up from the ground and start to exist. Neither does heaven. There was no rapture, right? There was no real rapture, but the idea of a rapture exists. The idea of mass extinction, as well as mass migration to a better place, because that's the whole idea fundamentally of the rapture, right? Is those that did good things get what they deserve and go to the good place, whereas those that did bad things are left behind to suffer, to exist, to deal with the conflicts that are left over, which, quite frankly, is inversely of how reality actually works. Because regardless of if reality is suffering, existence is suffering and pain, or existence is God's gift to us all, it just depends on how you perceive, how you interpret your experiences. And your experiences could be what you're watching right now. It's everything throughout every moment in time that you exist that occurs, that you observe. It all, no matter who you're born to, where you're born, where you're from, or anything, no matter any of that, it all depends on what exists. And our preservation of existence is what we will always consider to be good. Preservation of existence of the things that we like, things that we believe are good for our own preservation or for the preservation of those that we love, shape our ego and character. And what we understand behind those things, the truths, or what we don't understand, because that ignorance and what we don't see, what we don't experience, what we don't take the time to question, also lends to our ego and character. This is why there's the idea of someone being egotistical, believing too much in themselves, not having humility, not having the ability to question things, to question themselves. That exists, and that is fundamentally looked down upon because that is someone preserving their existence over yours. When someone is so sure of themselves to a point that they're willing to sacrifice you as a means to justify their own ends, or as an end to justify their own means, I should say. It's important to understand that. And same thing with character, as their experiences, depending on how they were brought up, depending on if they were taught about humility and self-reflection to begin with, or if they had experiences which lend to the possibility of such reflection. I mean, that's like similar to the whole idea of incarceration and rehabilitation, as opposed to just ending someone's life because they painted a house green or something, right? From the outlandish. Because that, I mean, that may happen eventually. That may have already happened in some scale or some degree. It could have been locally. It could have just been a neighbor that was upset that didn't like how someone painted their house and decided to end their existence because they thought it was that far out of line that it threatened their existence, which also lends to their comfort. Comfort as well plays a huge part. What someone is able to be comfortable with, or can find comfortable, or that they are willing to sacrifice to give up some comfort to have more long-term ease of mind. Again, lending to the whole preservation of your own existence. That lends to someone's character as well. So, there's so many of these different factors, which is why these two ideas of ego and character are sliding scales, similarly to how consciousness and intelligence of the individual is a sliding scale that lends to that. That's the neural network of, I mean, reality, of consciousness of human beings when you break it down in the philosophical way, using psychology, psychological understanding, and neuroscientific understanding. So, lastly, I'm going to leave off because this is a big ass friggin' lecture about ego and what plays into someone's ego. Because it's important to understand these aspects, and we'll probably draw as well on the little paint thing and lay out a little diagram at the end. But area of brain which preserves experiences. Because I'm curious where we stand currently in this understanding. So, main areas of the brain involved in preserving experiences are the hippocampus and the neocortex. These two regions work together with other brain structures in complex process of encoding, consolidating, and retrieving long-term memories. So the idea of long-term memory. Because short-term is, we can consider that the lived experience, whereas long-term memories, we're not living through that experience necessarily again, but it's our recollection of those experiences. And in order to do that, there has to be some way of remembering the emotional response that occurred from that experience, that observation of action, and actually living through the action, the effect that it had on you physically and mentally. Because that will also lend to character and someone's ego as to how they remember things. And typically, we have to reimagine things based on those emotions, based on those circumstances, and based on what we understand from lived experiences and from processes. So, with that in mind, like, say if someone has issues feeling or having empathy, like lack of empathy, then their recollection of certain experiences might lean toward something that isn't necessarily true. It could be somewhat exaggerated toward one way, because the only way for us to relive an experience is without actually reliving the experience at the same age, at the same time, with the same exact set of circumstances and everything, as we've laid out before, that ID tagging exists fundamentally in the quantum realm, in space and time. But in order to actually relive that to any extent, we have to use our imagination, which is based on what we experience fundamentally. It's based on the things that we experience that exist. Because we don't experience what necessarily what doesn't exist, we experience the change of state of existence, but it's not like we experience like the 1800s right now. We're not experiencing horseback riding and medieval battles, and or we're not experiencing the ice age, so we don't really know. We have to imagine in order to even think about it, in order to come to some sort of understanding of what might have actually happened without experiencing it. So if these are the parts of the brain that, I mean, do long-term memories, and that's all you really need to understand at this point. Does this actually, my other question is, like the folds in your brain, the large outer layer of the brain is the permanent, yeah. Is that not the folds of the brain that like develop more folds over time? During a process called systems consolidation, information initially processed by the hippocampus is gradually transferred to the neocortex for long-term storage. And so going back to what we observe, our reaction. So I can observe something like the statement, the neuroscience of memory, how a brain stores, yada yada. I don't really feel, I don't feel anything about this. I'm probably going to forget that title ever existed in the first place. But what I'm reading here, what I actually kind of care about and understanding the process matters a little bit more to me. It gives me a little bit more feeling, and it's making it easier to dive back and remembering what I experienced. So, and this is even me just self-reflecting on that whole idea of process, maybe even becoming ultra woke. But that's interesting. That is interesting. So this consolidation often happens during sleep. Oh, so when the hippocampus and neocortex engage in dialogue, just like, oh, strengthen the new neural connections. As memories age, become less dependent on the hippo. Oh, okay. And obviously, like the older you are, then more stuff that's going to be taking up space, and yep, emotional procedural amygdala, basal ganglia, cerebellum. So all these work in tandem to help us reimagine and understand our previous experiences, our memories. There's no just one hard drive necessarily. You can say the neocortex, I suppose, is, but everything plays a part. But mainly it's because of the emotional responses that we recall things, or what we remember from senses, like when we smell certain smells, it reminds us of certain foods. It reminds us of certain times that we smelled those smells. You know, if it's something smelled good, and we smell it again somewhere else, we're like, oh wow, I remember that time, I remember that place, because it smelled good. It was something that was inviting, that wanted you to fuel your body to continue existing. It all is emergent and somewhat divergent, because again, everything breaks down, but it's all related to existence and our understanding of existence and consciousness. That is how consciousness works. That is how it lends to ego. So finally, we'll just map it out real quick. How long was this? An hour. Wow. Big talk, big talk. So, unstable, sick. What else is new? So we're going to painstakingly do some stuff here. I'm going to do that. We're going to lay out ego. And I want to move this kind of toward now. Maybe make it a little bigger. Do like a 24. Sure. So we'll do ego. And we'll try to make a list of the different things that make up ego and character. Okay. So I got ego, character. Now, so both are relative to what we remember. Again, character is defined as the qualities of the individual. So let's do qualities of the individual. Boom. So qualities of the individual and ego. How do we describe that relative to part of the mind that mediates between conscious and the unconscious? So the processing. Yeah, it's like the processing of the individual, or processing of the qualities, which qualities are based on what we remember. So, oh, so processing of the individual. Hi, train. All right, because this is what we're analyzing, the individual being the individual consciousness. So consciousness is equal to, oh shit, whatever, roll with it. So individual consciousness is equal to what's understood from the experiences. So understanding of the experiences of the understanding of experiences. Sure. And that is measured in how equal no, I wouldn't necessarily. Well, yeah, because what we perceive from our experiences is clearly what we remember from our experiences as well. People can be having differences in the truth of the lived experience relative to what they perceive from that experience. So therefore, yes. All right. Perceived experiences versus truth of lived experiences. Because again, we can still experience, like, we can have lived experiences observing someone else's experiences, their interactions throughout space and time, right? So, our understanding of the truth of the lived experience, because the lived experience has real consequences that exist, whether you live through them or whether you view them, because those consequences can shape your ego and your character. Okay? So, going from here, do this a different color, maybe orange, sure. So, understanding of the experience, that's what individual consciousness versus intelligence, because intelligence is, well, no, I'll put that down here in the middle. Individual intelligence is how well those two things relate. Individual intelligence. Because someone can be physically, you can be blind. And I mean, you might be smarter in some aspects than someone else is than another, but if you can't see anything, especially from birth, it's going to be extremely hard for you to understand your environment, your real, tangible environment. That's just fundamentally true. No matter how you try to explain that, like, yeah, you can maybe understand what things smell better than anyone else, or you can hear more minute details in certain things, or be able to feel vibrations. I mean, that's partly why Beethoven was a musical genius. He was intelligent when you analyze his ability to manipulate sound, right? That's what it is by the end of the day when you're making music, when you're playing piano, you're manipulating the airwaves to produce sound, to produce songs, right? And it goes back to music theory and scientific relativity from that aspect. And to be able to be in Beethoven's shoes, you're not able to see what you're pressing, but you're able to press something and you're able to feel it. And you're able to feel the differences from one key to the next physically, even though you can't see it. You can kind of also use your motion of your muscles as well as your seating position. So say if you're sitting somewhere and you have the muscle memory to find the middle C key exactly where you're sitting right in front of you, then at that point, through experience, through practice, because you can still hear even if you can't see, but you can map out in your head, even if you don't know what the color of the keys are, you can map out where they are, right? And that's the type of consideration that made him able to be more intellectually better, more proficient in understanding music than other people, because those sound waves, when they travel through the air, you know, people can feel them, especially with, like, say, an organ or a big piano. You can physically feel them, especially as you tend toward the lower frequencies. All right, I know this is kind of a little off topic, but this is an example to kind of help make sense of the whole aspect. But even though he was blind, you know, the understanding of what colors are and, like, graphic design and stuff, you could say that he's not intelligent in any way with that. But when it comes to music, a genius, because he was able to feel aspects of the music and understand them, to be able to take the time to understand those things, because he wasn't able to see. That's all he could do. That's all that was allowed, but it allowed him to be more understanding of how music function emotionally, how it relates to waveforms, and feeling from one, physical, and two, from sound, and three, from muscle memory, from his physical feeling of the world. Through those faculties, he was able to make up for the deficiencies in the optical sense. So that's kind of the cool thing too about human consciousness, is that we have many different faculties of perception that allow us to perceive experiences and live through experiences differently. And those are all factors that lend to intelligence and consciousness. There's just so many things that we have to kind of break it down from this way and build up. So individual intelligence equals, how do I word this now? So understanding of, it's not just understanding, because individual consciousness is the understanding that exists, or understanding of the experiences. Probably overdo that. Hold on. This is gonna be like the next hour is just making a stupid freaking thing. Brother, where is... No, no, give me... Oh, I gotta get out of the freaking... Alright, do that. Boom. Me big black square. Dragon. So, in fact... Yeah, I'll put it in the center. So, individual consciousness equals... Yeah, it's gonna take me time to freaking word this. I should have prepared this beforehand. You know what? I'm gonna reset stream, but I'm gonna post this lecture first, and then we'll have a second one where we work on mapping this out. Alright? Anyways, until next time, this is Spark saying peace. Oh. Hey, but Jesus, my bad. My friggin' laptop was, meh. Thank you, though. Jeez. I'm gonna reset stream, though, because shit be whack. But yes.